Okay, we're ready to start, and Kathy just brought up an interesting thing. She said that she has a client that doesn't drink, but really could qualify for the program for being in recovery. When I'm working with people with addictions, with substance abuse problems, you see different things. Some people are very physiologically addicted. Some people, the bigger issues are the emotional and the psychological stuff. And it doesn't surprise me that you'll run into clients that they've got the self-centered fear, they've got the low self-esteem, they don't know quite where to be, and they may throw in that it's everybody else's fault. So you can work in the exact same way with people with those issues. I have had people that I have jokingly told them, I say, I really wish you'd just go out and drink some more so that I could send you to AA. Happily, nobody's done it. Yeah, I know, it's true. I don't say that to addicts. But Kathy, your point is very, very well taken. This is a model that's very helpful. One 12-step group is Emotions Anonymous. And I've sent people there that have benefited, and there's a couple people that I worked with that have been long-term members of EA and find it quite helpful. My experience is that the AA and NA people and those groups have a higher, I guess it would be a hit rate, a sense of people getting a lot of help out of it. And I always figure because it's more life and death, that people really are able to, are inclined to invest more time and energy in it because what brought them there had more intense negative feelings. So they're able to buy in on a deeper level. So we talked about fear. One of the lines in I think it's in the reason they call it the Big Book, as I said, it was Bill and Bob and 100 Drunk Salesmen that started the whole thing. And when they did the first edition of the Big Book, they printed it on thick paper so that it would look like it had more value. And that's how it got the name Big Book, is because it was thick, because they were trying to add substance to it so they could sell a few copies. So that's where that term comes from. But one of the lines in there is that, and it's not my favorite line, anger is the dubious luxury of normal men. These days would be anger is the dubious luxury of normal people. And then they say resentment is the number one offender. The number one reason that alcoholics go back out and drink is they get a resentment they can't get over. So here it is plain that a life, this is out of the Big Book, page 66, it is plain that a life that includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. We found that it is fatal. For when harboring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the Spirit. The insanity of alcohol returns and we drink again, and with us to drink is to die. Now, one of the reasons I like doing this presentation is to reduce the concept that AA is all about praying to God and being made better. And a lot of people have that concept. But clearly from this quote, you can see they have an acute, and it was an intuitive awareness of the importance of shifting our feelings, which to do so, it's essential to change the conversations. How many people do you know, whether they've ever had a drink or a drug in their life, have a really negative outlook? They're victims. Jerry knows somebody. Oh, good. They're victims. And if you had my life, you don't understand. I have to go to work. I have to do this with the kids. I have to do this. Victim, victim, victim. And with politics these days and what's going on in the world, it is really easy to be angry and resentful. The problem is when we're angry and resentful, we are suffering. Addicts use over that. Those of us that are not addicts, we have other coping mechanisms, some good, some not so good. But the early AAs realized that if you hang out in that place of you son of a bitch, for long enough, you're going to relapse. And you're going to be miserable prior to that. And if you've worked with addicts, you have heard them say, if this is all there is, I might as well use. And you'll also hear them say, if this is all there is, I'm either going to use or I'm going to kill myself. So our work as therapists is to help people shift out of that place with whatever means that we need to use. Now, a lot of people don't realize. Yeah, sure. I can try anyhow, but keep doing that if I'm not loud enough, okay? A lot of people don't realize that anger is a secondary emotion. Underneath or before anger is generally fear or hurt. Now, that's a simplification. But basically what we do when we see the saber-toothed tiger, we get scared. Now, if we end up just being immobilized by that fear, we're going to end up being lunch. So what we do is we skip over the fear, we skip over the hurt, and we go to anger because it's empowering. So there's a good million-year-old self-protection in doing that, but a lot of times now we're experiencing fear and we're experiencing resentment when it's not helpful. And addicts use over that. Most of this stuff comes from childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, and we developed a habit of becoming angry when stuff happens, or we become angry when we start a thought loop, and it works to our detriment. So getting over the habit of being resentful, getting over the habit of becoming angry when it's not happening, when it's not helpful. I'm going to tell you another story. I'm going to tell you my bus story, and it fits in with this, although it's about fear. Because most of us are very habitual in the feelings that we experience, and we're very habitual in the conversations we have with ourselves, and about life, and about everyone else. And a lot of what we're needing to do is change those conversations, change those internal dialogues. The only way to do that is to notice what the hell's going on. I actually tell all my clients there's only 3 things that I work on. And this is regardless of whether it has to do with alcohol and drugs or other addictive things. These are the only 3 things I work on. I help people learn to live in the present. I help people bring their life into their conscious awareness. And I help them to stop leading a fear-based life. Those are the only 3 things I work on. Everything else grows out of that. I can talk all day today about this stuff, but it comes out of those 3 things. Now the problem is most of us don't really have much of an accurate idea what really is going on in our life. That's that middle one, bring your life into your conscious awareness. We are living habitually. We're living out of our unconscious, or we're living out of habit, and because we're living out of habit, we don't know we're living out of habit. And that needs to change. So what happens, how many in this room, when you were a little kid, your parents said, if you don't study, you're never going to get anywhere? Okay. If you don't behave well, you're not going to have any friends. If you're good, I'm getting you this for Hanukkah, for Christmas. If you're bad, so what we learn early on is our well-being is in the future, and it's conditional. When I get this, when I get through exams, when I graduate, when I get to 2nd grade, when I graduate college, when I get the new car, the new job, the new whatever, when I get this or I get out of that, then I'll be good enough, then I'll be happy, then the good stuff starts. And this is, so our well-being is in the future and conditional. When your well-being is in the future and it's conditional, you have the chronic, generally unconscious, and sometimes conscious conversation going on in here of, I'm not okay. I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be okay when I get through exams. I'm going to be okay when I graduate. I'm going to be okay when I get the new girlfriend, the new boyfriend, the raise, the whatever. I'm never going to get that. I'm never going to get the raise. My boss is a jerk. When your well-being is in the future and it's conditional, you have this chronic conversation going on of, I'm not okay. Yeah.
The question that comes to my mind is, that's also the definition of a goal. And so how do you separate the two when you're working with someone?
And how I do it, in case I lose the thread, is talk about the difference between planning and projecting. Planning is studying. Projecting is, I'm going to do poorly on the exam. One is helpful, one isn't. Or the example I always give is planning is making reservations for a vacation, and projecting is figuring it's going to rain every day. One is helpful, one isn't. You spend 15 minutes making reservations and you worry for 2 hours a day for 6 months. And you get to the point where you're actually hoping it does rain, so you won't have wasted all that time worrying. And you have no idea what's going on because it's habit. So I do strategic planning. For organizations. I'm big on goals and mission, vision, goals, objectives, tasks. And whenever I start strategic planning, I always start with the awareness I'm going to be wrong. We'll have made a mistake, or circumstances will change, or people aren't up to the job. But the thing is, we have feedback loops. So what we want to do in life is develop feedback loops, so we're not living in this story of how we're never going to be okay. And ultimately, going back to where I was, what we want to do is come to know is, I am okay here and now, rather than I will be okay when. As far as I'm concerned, one way to think about how many people slide into addiction, this is not universal, but how many people slide into addiction is they've got this, when I get through exams then I'll be okay, which leads to I'm not okay. And so they're not okay, they're 13 years old, they're 15, they're 17, they've got teenage angst, they've got acne, and their hormones are going wild, and nobody talks to them, nobody likes them, and they take a drink. This certain percentage of people, they take a drink, they take a hit of pot, and they go, oh my God, this is the way I should always feel. And what's just happened is that drink and that pot got rid of the future and the past. Now sometimes it happens instantly for people. They're going to be in trouble early on. More people slide into it. They've gotten to a point. They're in college. They're post high school or college. They're working, and work is difficult. My boss is a jerk, and all the regulations these days, and this and that. And they go to their neighborhood bar. They go to the package store. They go to their shelf. There was no bad day. There is no tomorrow. I am not talking about having consumed large quantities of whatever. Just the ritual, just the psychological impact of knowing you have a home free, you have a safe space where there is no longer this unconscious, obsessive conversation of how your well-being is then. That is what leads people into addiction, many people. So the work for us as therapists, and what happens in 12-step environment, is people start developing the competency to be able to tell the difference when they're present and when they're not. They develop other coping mechanisms to dissipate unhelpful fear, anger, resentment, guilt, shame, anxiety, things that are coming on largely habitually, some of them genetically, but it helps them develop other coping mechanisms. So what we're trying to do when we're talking about recovery versus quitting drinking or abstinence. For the general public, you haven't had a drink for a month, you're sober. In the addictions field, we call that being dry or being abstinent. And the thing, and so what we're after helping people become emotionally sober, rather than simply abstinent from a substance. So I'm going to tell you my fear story. This is the bus story. I could change it a little because the bus station's right here. But my office is over on Aurora Street, so I always use Seneca Street. So over on Seneca Street, there's a bus station. Seneca Street's one way running that way. So let's say that you're over on Seneca Street, and for some reason you're standing in the street. I don't actually know why you're standing in the street, but you're standing in the street, and you look to your left, and there's a bus coming. And it's 30 feet away doing about 30 miles an hour. In that instance, it is a good idea to get scared and get the hell out of the street, or you will die. So fear, like all of our feelings, gives us valuable information that helps us live, helps us thrive, when it comes at the right time and in the right amounts. Well, let's say, once again, you're over on Green or Seneca Street, and you're standing in the street, and you look to your left. And when you look to your left, there's a bus coming, but this time the bus is 2 blocks away. Now, in that second instance, there is an action you need to take. You need to step up on the sidewalk. When you're on the sidewalk, you're safe. But because the bus is 2 blocks away, it is not beneficial to experience fear in that instance. Nobody's holding you there in the street. But many people will experience fear, largely out of habit. And finally, in the third instance, you're over there on Seneca Street again, and you're still standing. I don't know why you're standing in the street. We could talk about that. But you're standing in the street, and you look to your left. Now, the corner of your eye, you catch a billboard picture of a bus and have a startle response. That is not helpful at all. And that response is not based on anything going on in the world. That response is a misinterpretation of incoming data. It's a misunderstanding of what's going on, very likely informed by an earlier life event. So a lot of what we're doing here as therapists and what people are doing in the 12-step rooms is helping people become more competent in real time to be able to tell the difference between when they're in crisis, when there's an action you need to take, and when you're simply having an emotional response to some earlier life event. And a lot of us end up using because we respond to everything as if it's a crisis. You know, every time we get a text from somebody that's, you know, they're mad about something, it's like, oh my God. Well, actually, it's just a text, and whatever it was already happened, 9 out of 10 times. But we're in the habit of having these responses. So we're working in this thing they call recovery on changing that. Now we're going to go into the steps. So the first step, we're going to go through all 12 steps and a few other things, and I may touch on the traditions if we have time at the end. So we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. Now, how many people have heard the alcoholism counselors saying that trying is lying? When you're trying to stop drinking, you're lying. When you're trying to quit drugs, you're lying. Trying is lying. That's an addiction field saying rather than a 12-step saying. But there's merit to it, and I think it's a really important concept for us that are working with people who are trying to address their addictions. They call the first step the surrender step or the acceptance step. So when I am trying to not drink or trying to not do drugs, my view of what's going on in here is our unconscious mind is once again chronically, and usually working overtime, having a conversation of, have I been good enough long enough? Do I hurt badly enough? I am never going to drink again unless I get cancer. I am never going to drink again unless I get fired. I am never going to drink again unless blah, blah, blah. When, have I been good? Can I get away with it? Really the only reason I need to not drink or do drugs is because it affects me negatively professionally. So if I go to California, I could use there because nobody will know. And what the first step is about is you get to a point where you in your own head are going, I am a non-drinking, non-drugging alcoholic or drug addict. I no longer drink or do drugs rather than I'm trying to not drink or do drugs. And what happens is that shifts the unconscious conversation from an ongoing dialogue to something that has a tendency to cut it off abruptly. I'm done. I'm not drinking. What happens? There's this old lady, Emma, in Ithaca forever, and she was old when I was young, and she used to say, well, if your ass falls off, put it in a wheelbarrow and bring it to a meeting. If you get to the end of your rope, tie a knot in it and hang on. psychologically, it's a very different thing to say, I am not using no matter what, rather than I'm not going to use unless my drug dealer happens to show up and offer me something free, which happens, and drug dealers do it fairly regularly. Because all you have to do is give somebody a little taste, and quite often the compulsion switch goes back on. Addiction is regarded as an obsessive compulsive behavior. If you stop using, the first thing that happens is the compulsion goes away once you get through withdrawal. It doesn't mean that craving always goes away, but the compulsion goes away. And then what you want to have go away is the obsessive thought about it. And so, and usually what happens is somewhere between a day and a couple of years of being abstinent and doing the recovery thing, either with a therapist or 12-step stuff, you wake up one day and realize, I didn't think about drinking yesterday. I haven't thought about drinking for 2 days. So it's in retrospect, something has changed. And part of the work is you work on these other things, you work on these feelings, and these unknown triggers that cause people to want to escape, to want to get okay, to want to get rid of the future past, they diminish. So the first step is a surrender step. It's a subtle and profound change of self-talk and consequent diminishment of the urge to drink. First order change versus second order change. First order change, I'm no longer drinking or doing drugs. Second order change is, well, I'm not pissed about it anymore. You got a whole lot of people that, they're on paper, they cracked up the car, they got a DWI, the wife or the husband or the boss says you can't, they're not using, but they are not happy. And what we're after is emotional sobriety, second order change, helping people learn how to be comfortable in their own skin without alcohol and drugs, rather than simply making them good citizens or well-behaved people. Second step, yes?
So we work with college students, and I think that creates like a special kind of place, because I think they're seeing their peers use in a way that they're kind of like, so there's that constant comparison of like, so I have had students where they've been like, but I don't want to be abstinent, I want to use in like.
They want to use successfully, absolutely.
So is that like and how do you have that conversation with kind of?
That is when I do the contract for controlled using. And I let them know, if you are not addicted, you can be successful at this. And so around smoking pot, a lot of college kids are smoking pot. I point out to them that smoking pot by yourself in your dorm room or bedroom is not social using. It's not partying. If people were using alcohol that way, they're only drinking by themselves in their bedroom, they would call that closet drinking. And there's a sort of a social norm that ain't right. With pot, since it's illegal, every use of it is something that needs to be cloaked, and so it's much easier to have a rationalization. I'm just partying. I like to smoke. And since it's all covert, it's harder to deal with. So you let people know smoking by yourself is not social. That smoking before class and then trying to act straight or trying to concentrate isn't a good investment. Your parents are spending $60,000 a year. The idea isn't for you to be wasted or baked, in class. And so you talk about social using. So you smoke on Friday and Saturdays, X number of times under certain circumstances, like with people, and then see if they can adhere to it. And you let them know in advance. If you can't, if you're volunteering to this commitment and then you're unable to do it, we probably need to look further. You may have a problem. That's how I would start with it. Pot is a very difficult drug to deal with because it's not as dramatic as booze or as opiates or cocaine. And so the helping people identify that it's really a problem is quite difficult because it's a very small percentage of people who really become psychotic and things like that, although it does happen. So we're after second order change. We're after having people actually enjoy life without alcohol and drugs rather than just either comply or behave. Now this is the first step that deals with the God stuff, which is difficult for a lot of clinicians and for a lot of people as they approach the idea of this thing called recovery, and it probably always will be for some. And a lot of people, it's what gets them to go away the first time or the second time, and a lot of people that changes after things have gotten bad enough and they sort of open up and say, okay, I'll just skip over that for now. But the way I think about this second step, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, is I regard that as the hope step. And I feel that there's no theology required. People that are addicted are generally really unhappy. You know, they've woken up suicidal a lot. They prayed to the God they don't believe in. Get me out of this one. I'll never do it again. They're often angry. Everybody's angry at them. Basically, and they have that, I can't use anymore because when I do, I get arrested. And my life is over. My life is over. And most of the time, the people they socialize with sort of drink and do drugs the way they do. Now, some addicts are more closeted in their use, and they're already isolated, so they're a little beyond this anyhow. But classically, I only drink as much as my friends. I only smoke as much pot as my friends, and oftentimes they're accurate. Sometimes they're in denial, but oftentimes they're accurate. They haven't noticed, so when they were drinking a six-pack or a bottle of wine a day, that they were hanging out with people that drank a six-pack or a bottle of wine. And when they went to 2 six-packs or 2 bottles of wine, they shifted friend groups, and they didn't notice. So they're accurate, but they're sort of missing something that's really important there. What often happens in 12-step settings, and sometimes it's in meetings, sometimes it's in coffee before or after, or just a 5-minute connection with somebody before or after a meeting. What happens is people get some hope. They go from hopeless, and an experience that I know about is a person who was their first night in rehab, miserable, everything in their life was wrong, and they'd been on quite a run. And there was somebody at the front of the room. The rehab had brought in an AA speaker meeting, and the guy standing up and telling his story was telling a story very similar to the life story of this individual, and everybody in the room was laughing. This guy was talking about losing relationships, losing jobs, buying a lot of booze around Christmas time as if he was having a party and then drinking it all himself, buying an ounce of cocaine for a New Year's party and doing it all before New Year's by himself, and people were laughing. And this guy identified years later that from that laughter, he got hope. He got hope that, well, if that guy can get sober, I can get sober. And something in him shifted. Once again, we're talking about feelings. Hope is a feeling. You do not get to choose to be hopeful. You don't get to choose to stop being hopeless. It either happens or it doesn't. A lot of people it happens, and it happens in their first meeting or their 50th meeting, or talking to somebody, or maybe reading some literature. It often happens in a therapist's office. And so I regard the second step as the hope step, and it would be the type of thing that somebody shows up at one of those 6 meetings, and they get a few laughs, or they feel safe, or somebody says something they relate to, and they go, I'll come back. Maybe. That's it. Nothing else is required as far as I'm concerned. No theology, and it's something that people can go and do this stuff, and the switch doesn't go off. No hope happens. Now, in those people, when I'm working them with clients, I'm looking at the depression issue and thinking about meds. It's not that AA or NA is the only tool in the box for us as therapists. As a matter of fact, Bill Wilson was a major depressive. He was throughout his life, including after he had started AA, and he was a big proponent of vitamin B. matter of fact, it became quite controversial in AA. But it is very, very common for people in recovery in 12-step settings to have dual diagnoses, and they need to be attended to. AA people are not always helpful at doing that. And so us as therapists, we need to be a counterweight to the people who say, oh, if you're really in recovery, you're not going to be taking antidepressants or even benzos. We need to help people do what they need to do. So that is an issue that needs to be attended to. The third step. Yes, Jerry.
Recommendations for some comments or ideas towards strengths that we can encourage strength thoughts, let's put it like that, or counter comments for those that are attending a meeting that they find helpful to them, but then they're on that approach of total abstinence from all pharmaceuticals as well. That makes them uncomfortable. It's really rough.
It is. So what Jerry was asking about, how can you help your clients when they're going to a meeting they like or they sort of like, and somebody or more than one somebody is discouraging use of properly prescribed medications?
And I mean, it goes beyond that, because many times it's like the comment is made, and so they're questioning it, like, well, what does this mean, and does this group really represent that? So they might then go to others in that group and ask them about it, and they might have been individuals who wouldn't really have commented about it, except when they're questioned, and so the opinion begins to develop that, wow, I guess everyone here really feels that way.
And that's a big risk. And there's other biases that people can pick up in 12-step settings. And as therapists, we need to pay attention to that. And the way I put it is, I'm against fundamentalism of any type, of fundamentalism of the left or fundamentalism of the right. What we want to do is help people see things as much as they are as possible, as accurately and skillfully as we can. And I'm not terribly subtle about these things. I would say AA or NA is not a good place to get legal advice. It's not a good place to get relationship advice. It's not a good place to get medical advice. And I would tell people is, if you're going to a doctor and getting scripts, it's really important to let the doctor or the nurse practitioner know that you're in recovery. And that you need to stay away from drugs that have a tendency to be abused. And I also tell people about Bill Wilson and the concept of what they call going to any lengths. And going to any lengths is going to the doctor and getting meds when you need them. Well, the founder of AA did that. And a lot of people in AA don't know that. A lot of people don't know the history, they don't know the reality that he had this major depression, and he advised basically self-prescribing vitamin B to deal with it. Bill Wilson also did LSD with Timothy Leary in the 1950s, before it was illegal, when Timothy Leary was still at Harvard. Bill did LSD in an effort to get over his depression. So tell that to people. The founder of AA did acid to deal with depression. And in AA, they have the term going to any lengths. And going to any lengths is going to a therapist, is going to rehab, is taking properly prescribed meds. And I always recommend paying attention. There are a lot of it's problematic. A lot of people come into my office that are addicted, and they've been on benzos for a long time. Benzos are very, very addictive. And if you've been taking benzos daily for a period of time, the benzos you're taking today, about their only benefit is to keep you from going into withdrawal from the ones you took yesterday. That is about the only benefit. If you're afraid to fly and you need to fly and you take a Xanax and you're in recovery, or you have an interview, or you have some other thing that's very difficult, taking them once in a while is very beneficial and helpful. but you don't, and doctors often aren't aware of this. So you need to be skillful, and you need to educate your clients about the different classes of drugs. This can be difficult for social workers or psychologists who are not licensed medical people. So I let people know that this is a layperson's opinion, and it's something I'm very comfortable with. And finally, if somebody is being pushy about not taking drugs or this and that, I would tell them to shut the fuck up. You know, that's people kill people, and it's really sad. But like everything else, this 12-step thing is imperfect, and everybody in it is an amateur. They're not trained professionals. They don't get an educational thing on how to handle this type of personality and this type of personality. Some people are brilliant at it, and some people just don't get it at all. So that's sort of my take on that. Any other questions? Yeah, Nancy.
I have a question I had about people whose primary substance is marijuana going to AA. How are they treated? Is there a bias there?
Oh, I could get myself in trouble with this one. Thank you, and please keep asking me that. The question is, what about the potheads? Sending them to AA. AA is very clear that, matter of fact, the third tradition of AA is the only requirement for AA membership is the desire to stop drinking. And particularly back in the 60s and early 70s, when everybody started doing drugs and a lot of the long hairs started showing up in redneck AA meetings, there was a lot of discussion about what do we do with all these potheads and the people doing LSD and things like that. And they said, we need to stick to our singleness of purpose, alcohol. And generally at the beginning of every meeting, part of what they read is, please keep your sharing to how it relates to alcohol and alcoholism. And the vast majority of people in recovery in AA these days abused other substances. So there's an etiquette that, and I send a lot of people with other drug issues to AA. AA in Ithaca has more sobriety, more people who have sort of gotten the good stuff or are dealing well with the emotional stuff than in NA. NA is very helpful. I do send people to NA, and I encourage them, if they like it, to keep doing it. But I tell them what a guy I knew years ago said. He was what at that time they called cross-addicted, which means he was alcoholic, but he was addicted to other substances, or at least he abused them. He said, when I go to AA, I introduce myself as an alcoholic. And when I go to NA, I introduce myself as a drug addict. And I do it out of courtesy to the old timers. So that's how he handled it. There's other people that I know of that feel that they have both issues and go to AA, and they'll introduce, say, I'm so-and-so, I'm an alcoholic, and generally everybody goes, hi, so-and-so, and I'm also a drug addict. And so it's a way to give a respectful nod to the singleness of purpose, and also to acknowledge the other issues, and also invite the people who might be potheads or heroin addicts or other opiates that they're welcome. And so that's sort of how I see it and recommend it. I do forewarn people, if their drug of choice is something other than alcohol and they're going to AA, is try and be courteous to people about how you talk. And I say, well, whenever you hear the word alcohol, substitute the word opiate or oxy or pot or ecstasy or whatever it might be. So that's how I handle it. It's not ideal. And there is some merit. Really, the biggest thing that they don't like to have is somebody go on for 10 minutes talking about a heroin run or a crack run or and stuff like that. But generally, it's pretty open and accepting these days. And there are people in Ithaca AA that identify that when they say, "Hi, I'm so and so," and then say, "I'm an addict," and they, at most meetings, it's not a problem. And the problem, where it is a problem, they probably don't go. Any other questions at this time? Okay, the third step, major God step. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. Now, this can be a problem if you're not from a Judeo-Christian background, or I guess Muslim background. You know, how do that's pretty clear. I'm turning my life over, and you know, I've had people say, you know, if my higher power wanted me to be sober, I wouldn't be drinking. But I also feel that there's no theology required for this, and that comes from talking to an AA member years ago, and what he told me. He said there's two parts to the third step: faith and footwork. First comes the footwork. So he said what that is you make a commitment to do the rest of the steps, which we're going to go over later. So, you know, hold on to this part while we do that part, and it'll make sense to you. So the first part is you make a commitment to do the rest of the steps, and then he said, and then you do them. You don't just make a commitment and then not do it. And that's the difference between talking the talk and walking the walk. So I'm going to do, you know, I'm going to get a sponsor, and I'm going to do step 4 and 5 and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You're going to do. So that's the footwork part. And what people what happens if you are a drug addict or you are an alcoholic and you simply stop drinking and doing drugs, there's a very good chance that action alone is going to make your life start to get better. You'll stop waking up hungover. You'll stop having to steal stuff so you can buy dope. You know, you'll start to be able to show up where you say you're going to show up. I mean, things trend in a good direction just from that action. If you start doing other things like you stop lying and things like that, you know, the trend continues. And if you do the steps that I'm going to describe, that also happens. So the way I put it is, first you do the footwork. You stop using, you start showing up, you start having better hygiene, and eventually you're going to be off probation or parole. You get a new boyfriend or a new girlfriend, you get a job, stuff happens. And the way I put it is, the lucky ones notice that their life is getting better. Because a lot of people, their life gets better, but they're so habituated to be stuck in the negative that they literally do not experience the good stuff. And all of you in here know somebody like this. They have 20 good things happen a day, and the only thing they remember is the jerk that cut them off in traffic, or the slight that they got from their boss or their partner. Or this is the only thing that registers. Those people are in trouble. They have a high probability of relapse. The AA people and stuff does have approaches for dealing with that. A simple one is what they call gratitude lists. They have people do written gratitude lists. It's great. You get an old like Harley biker, or some old redneck, or to write gratitude lists. Are you out of your mind? But they start doing it, and what happens? And they're doing functional MRIs now that show that the brain changes as you do this stuff. The axons that were communicating all the negative self-talk, they're highly developed. The ones that have the thoughts of things that are good are atrophied, or they're underdeveloped. You start doing written gratitude lists, you're actually able to start to realize that this negative thing is only 5% of my life, and this other stuff is 95% of my life. And it actually is able then to get into long-term memory. If it doesn't get into long-term memory, it's trouble. So as therapists, we can help our clients move towards emotional sobriety by helping them change that aspect of their self-talk. And the 12-step people have very handy tools for doing that are very effective, even if they're sort of cutesy. And it actually is, if you think about it, it's interesting stuff. So you do the footwork. If you're lucky, you notice your life has gotten better. Or if you're doing that aspect of the footwork, written, gratitude lists and stuff like that. There are other things too, but that's just one that comes to mind. And then you end up with the feeling of faith. So when I talk about faith, I am not talking about a theology. I am not talking about I've accepted Jesus or Buddha or Allah as my Savior, therefore I'm going to heaven, I have faith, I believe. That's a theology. It's very helpful for some people. It's not helpful for others. But the most foundational, important part is that feeling of habitual okayness rather than the feeling of chronic lack of okayness or the feeling of crisis or the waiting for the other shoe to drop or being stuck in your head with the I am never going to be okay. That is what we're after to have change, is going from that I'm not okay and I'm not going to be okay to I am fundamentally okay, up to and including dying. Now, I'm not saying that I'm going to be there myself as that gets closer, as I get the diagnosis, as this thing's going on. But as I'm going through my life at this time, I don't spend a lot of time being worried about dying. I am aware that it is inevitable. And for the most part, I'm sort of living life and enjoying it rather than living in fear of that happening. And I have an awesome life. Yeah?
And is that what you mean by experiential faith?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
got it.
it is a feeling rather than a thought or cognition or theology. It's a a feeling of okayness. Yeah, that's it. It might sound like a little bit of a letdown, but inner peace. What I tell all my clients is, I want you to have inner peace and equanimity, inner peace and balance. And a lot has to happen for a person to get from where they start out to having that. And then there's more that needs to be done to maintain it. But it's possible most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time.
So,
Evie?
in a really concrete thinker's way.
Yes.
The idea of, because people read this, they look at that stuff and they see care of God.
Yeah.
In a concrete way, care of God translates, if I'm understanding you correctly, to this feeling of wholeness, of peace.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, via doing the steps. And so the question was, does the care of God, does that translates into a feeling of peace, and that's true. And a lot of people for this concept of a higher power, or God as you understand him, they say it can be a group of drunks, good orderly direction, just your AA people. They do recommend against making any one individual your higher power. Although sometimes that happens, and quite often it's an early girlfriend or boyfriend that they get and they're not supposed to, but that's just sort of the way life happens. So yes, it is that internal feeling, that quiet inner voice, that peaceful thing that happens for the fortunate ones. And once again, this will make more sense when after we've talked about the rest of the steps. Now, the fourth step, now to me, this is where the serious cognitive behavioral therapy happens. On the sheet that had the definition of cognitive behavioral therapy, there's a little thing on the bottom with 3 columns. And we want to refer to that on this page or the next one. So, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Now, it's not exactly my language as far as limiting it to a moral inventory. But how they do it and what it accomplishes is profoundly significant for many people. And it often is life-changing, sometimes not in the moment, but over time. But basically what they have do, if you look at your handout with this chart here, there's 3 columns. I don't know if I have it. I don't have the 3 columns, but I do have a good quote. The most common symptoms of emotional insecurity are worry, anger, self-pity, and depression. So now we're talking about addiction. And we're talking about helping people stop using alcohol and drugs or engaging in other obsessive compulsive behaviors. Who would have thought that what is important there is dealing with worry, anger, self-pity, and depression? That's what they do in 12-step settings. They deal with these feelings. They're not just sitting around going, God, fix me, or, oh, please help me not drink. These stem from causes which sometimes seem to be within us and at other times come from without. So within us, there's a genetic part for a lot of times. Or it's the habits that we developed as a result of early childhood stuff in combination with the genetics. Or it's coming out. It's what's going on in my primary relationship. It's what's going on in my work life, in my school life. To take inventory of this respect, we ought to consider carefully all personal relationships which bring continuous or recurring trouble. Who would have thunk? These drunks are talking about figuring out relationships. Now, why does somebody have to do that? Well, if you're having intermittent or continuous conflict with people, you're going to have anxiety. You're going to be angry. At times you're going to have guilt. You're going to have shame. You're going to have resentment. If you have those things too much and too long, you're likely to relapse. So these people intuited that they needed to fix that. They needed to work on that. So that's what happens in a 12-step environment over time. Some of it comes out of the 12-step literature, what they call the program, and some of it comes out of the fellowship. In the 4th and 5th step, it really is part of, it has a piece of both. Referring to, now here's where the education is. Now you have these first 3 columns. I am resentful at. They do 3 parts of 3 different topics when they're doing a 4th step. They have you do a resentment list, a sex inventory, and a money inventory. I might be leaving something out. But you start out with the resentments. Who am I resentful at? And this is sort of interesting, and if you knew the biography of Bill Wilson, this would make more sense. Bill had a lot of issues with relationships and women and sex. And so there's a lot more in here than normally would get into a book in the 1930s. And interestingly, although he wasn't totally successful with dealing with it, he actually worked to try and figure out how to conduct himself in a way that was more congruent with his belief system. So who am I resentful at? Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, and you can read those things. The cause, what the person did to cause me to resent them. And finally, what it affected. And this is a little bit weak, but they have the concepts down there. They're, sex, relationships, fear, self-confidence, self-esteem, security, things like that. 3 columns. But then if you read a couple more pages in the book, there's a paragraph that begins with that line, referring to our list again. And what that speaks to is a 4th column, which is where the cognitive behavioral therapy fits in. Putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done, we resolutely looked for our own mistakes. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened? So our mistakes is not where did I steal stuff? What lies had I told? What things did? Where had I been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened? Though a situation had not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. Where were we to blame? The inventory was ours, not the other man's. That would be the other person's if they updated this. When we saw our faults, we listed them. We placed them before us in black and white. We admitted our wrongs honestly and were willing to set these matters straight. This is where the learning comes in for the person in usually early recovery, although some people do a 4th step when they're 10, 15 years sober. But people are encouraged to start doing this stuff fairly early on. And once again, who would have thought that overcoming the discomfort associated with not drinking or doing drugs would be resolved by looking at where you'd been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened. But I think it's extremely insightful. Half my clients that have addiction issues come in blaming everyone else for their life. The other half come in blaming themselves for everything. Neither is accurate. So once again, we want to try and help people come by the whole picture, to shift their focus from where they'd been spending all their time and energy on how you done me wrong and how if you had, you know, this relationship or this job, you'd drink too, or to, oh, this is how I contribute to that. Now, some people that, and we all have had them as clients, they've had serial bad relationships. And quite honestly, they often have serial bad relationships with people who are jerks. They're truly jerks. Well, what's my contribution to that? Well, my picker's busted. I don't know how to date. I don't know how to identify my needs and my wants. I don't know how to interact with people and make healthy decisions and be involved with people that I have a chance of having an enjoyable relationship with. And I need a therapist to learn about that. You know, and so there's a lot of really interesting, profound stuff that comes out of the fourth and the fifth step. Yeah. Tommy?
Thank you. Thank you. As I unveiled that, to me, it speaks to powerful liberation,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
which becomes a challenge for some folks now that they're liberated. They feel displaced,
Mm-hmm.
struggle with that relationship with self.
Yes, so Tommy's saying that it's like liberation, freedom or liberation, and it is, and a lot of people then don't know what to do with that.
That's my point.
And that's something, that's one of the things, the marathon runner story. Okay, now you've gotten to a point where you're doing 10 miles, you're doing 15 miles, and there's a different set of needs at that than when you're still back to walking a mile. And there's different insights, there's different strengths, and there's different capacities. And you're still developing the skills and the competencies. And one of the things they recommend in 12-step programs, don't get into any new relationships. Don't get into any romantic relationships your first year in recovery. This is sort of the main suggestion that everyone ignores. Often leading to relapse. Back in the 30s, yes, it's sexist. It was appropriate for the age and time. Though, it was behind every skirt is a slip. And people drank and drink over getting their feelings hurt, or not getting their needs met, or not getting what they want or deserve, or this and that. And there's a lot of work to be done with that. But I always tell people, I say it's really hard to figure out how to be in a relationship all by yourself. So over time, we got to evolve that and help people identify, what their needs and their wants are. What type of relationship do I want? What type of person, am I comfortable with? Who am I guaranteed to fight with no matter what? And that can come, quite honestly, for some people, they get it out of their relationships for women, with other women in the rooms, and for men, ideally other men in the rooms. That's not universally how it happens, but that's what is recommended. In Ithaca, there is a very strong recovering community of women who are really doing awesome at learning and growing in this town right now. It's really quite cool. Notice the word fear is bracketed alongside the difficulties with Mr. Brown. That's on this sheet. And Mrs. Jones, the wife and the employer. This short word somehow touches about every aspect of our lives. It was an evil and corroding thread. The fabric of our existence was shot through with it. It set in motion trains of circumstances which brought us misfortune we felt we didn't deserve. But did not we ourselves set the ball rolling? Sometimes we think fear ought to be classed with stealing. It seemed to cause more trouble. Now, the three things I work on: learn to live in the present, bring your life into your conscious awareness, and stop living a fear-based life. It makes sense that I'd like this one. But it's relating to what I was saying a moment ago. How many people in this room, and you do not have to raise your hands, have stayed in a relationship too long because we were afraid of being alone, or we were afraid it was our fault and we just needed to change? Fear impacts us in a lot of different ways that are not quite as obvious as one might think. The fifth step. Now, the fourth and fifth step generally go hand in hand in 12-step environment. They all recommend that you get a sponsor. There actually is no reference to sponsorship in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. Where it actually came from was in very early AA. You would not be admitted into an AA meeting unless someone sponsored you, unless somebody vouched for you, because they're very concerned about their reputations and anonymity and having their careers ruined. That's where sponsorship came from. But it evolved into a thing of somebody that's got a little time to take you under their wing and to help you sort of get the idea what this is all about. And ultimately, these days, a key part of sponsorship is getting the newer person through step 4 and 5 and steps 8 and 9 in particular, both of which it's a good idea to have some coaching around those things. Many sponsors in the 12-step programs will be much more involved in the local Food Addicts Anonymous. In Ithaca, the Overeaters Anonymous, there's Overeater Anonymous and Food Addicts Anonymous, and the Food Addicts Anonymous are a little more militant. They bring scales. They are very strict in what foods are permitted and not permitted. And basically, if you're not willing to stick to the regimen, they give you the heave-ho. Not literally kick you out, but you're not going to get the support that you would otherwise. But sponsors do that with the FA, and it's very helpful for a lot of people. Other people, it turns them off. In AA and NA, you'll have all variations of personalities and I guess competencies around being helpful or unhelpful. There are a lot of lines that talk about the old timers, and usually people that talk about the old timers are imagining life the way it never was, but they don't know that. And when I first came in, they didn't have rehabs. Well, they had rehabs. Bill went to rehab before he got sober. When I got sober, we did 12-step calls, and people would be drunk and falling out of the car, and we'd do this and that, and it's like, oh my God, shoot me. But there's people who are wonderfully helpful and supportive, and there are people who are not kind and can be abusive, and certainly they can be ignorant. But on average, there's a lot of help and there's a lot of love. One of the ways, there's a saying that, when you go get into the rooms, you're supposed to sit down, shut up, and listen. Another one is take the cotton out of your ears and put it in your mouth. Now, my view of that is that there's some people that need to sit down, shut up, and listen, and there's some people that need to sit down and talk. And people that are skillful in AA will recognize the difference between the two, and they're encouraged the ones that are totally ego-driven and arrogant and this and that to sit down and shut up, and the ones that are introverted or fearful to open up and be connected and doing what they can to make them feel safe. It doesn't always happen. Just like when people come to different therapists, they're going to connect better with one personality or style or another. So as clinicians, what we can help people do is be aware that this particular version or this particular brand is not the only way, and to keep going to someplace else until they find something that feels right for them and connected. So now with this fifth step, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. For anybody that was raised Catholic, there might be something about this that seems vaguely familiar. But the way I think about it, and I'm referring to confession, and I think that it's somewhat different than confession is my understanding of how it often is these days. These days, a lot of religion can be largely ritualistic. And a lot of the original meaning in teachings about love and compassion and repenting and forgiveness are often lost in the ritual and in wanting to behave or meet the cultural norms. I think probably one way to think about this fifth step is probably more like confession would have been in the year 50, when there was a very close personal contact, and it had to do with really shifting feelings and behaviors rather than doing what your parents told you to do, you know, on Saturday night or Sunday morning or whatever. So in that aspect, it's similar. But there's another piece to it, a couple pieces. One is that many, if not most addicts, really feel other. They feel like they don't belong, they don't fit in. Maybe it's shame. You know, nobody did the bad things that I did. You know, no one, stole things like that. No one stole their mother's wedding ring and sold it. Although a whole lot of addicts have done that. Nobody, did this type of crime or that type of crime. So there's a lot of guilt and shame and isolation and a lot of other. And talking about what was written in the fourth step helps break that barrier of different and other, and I'll never belong, and I'll never be okay, and I'll never be good enough. That is one aspect that can be very helpful. Another thing that can be very helpful, it often happens in when you do and they say you can do a fifth step with your priest, a trusted advisor, a sponsor. They very clearly say only do a fifth step with someone you can trust. Trust to not break your confidence, and ideally to not give you bad advice. And that's critical. So they say, if that's not somebody in AA or a sponsor, is find someone else, like a therapist, that you can do this with. So the breaking out of isolation, breaking out of other, and one thing else is letting go of shame. What'll happen is if you do this with a sponsor and you say, I did this thing to this guy that I was involved with, or this woman that I was involved with, and I hate myself for it, or I stole this from my boss, I did this and that, and then the sponsor goes, oh yeah, I did that too, I hate it. And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, I am not the worst piece of you-know-what in the universe. And there's a diminishment of the overwhelming shame and guilt. We need a diminishment of shame and guilt along with a diminishment of anxiety and anger and resentment. This is how that can come about. Now, there's one other piece, the exact nature of our wrongs part. And this is an interesting concept, and I don't know that I've really heard too many people talk about this, but there was a guy he was sort of on the AA speaker tour, which there's not supposed to be one of, but there is, and people, they don't get paid for it, but they're entertaining and insightful speakers, and they get invited if there's a convention in Syracuse or LA or something. They'll have people that have a good story, a good message, come and talk. And there was this guy, Earl, Bob Earl was his name. He's probably dead, maybe not, but he had a story about this exact nature of our wrongs, and it fits in with what we do as therapists. And Bob was illiterate, drug addict on the streets of LA, got sober at 26, great storyteller, and in fact, he would tell a story about the first time he prayed to God. It's like he hated God, and he had an abusive father, so he hated all this stuff. And the first time he prayed to God, God help me, and the next day he broke his back at work. So he wasn't too enthused. But he ended up being on disability, and they tried to find him like suitable employment, and he was fairly psychotic. So he was, he was having all sorts of different senses of who he was. And he ended up talking them into allowing him to work on becoming a writer, even though he was illiterate. This guy sold his first screenplay and became a famous screenwriter for the next 30 years. He also got married 7 times in sobriety. So there was a few places he didn't quite get it all. And he would tell the story about being 17 years sober, and he was a sort of a militant right-wing AA'er. You do it by the book. He would be one, you don't take any meds, and matter of fact, he had a line about when one of his sponsees would tell him that he's getting into therapy. He said, well, I want to wish you the best with your new therapist and with your new sponsor, because he would fire the sponsees if he went into therapy. And then he told the story about how he sort of came to one day when he was 17 years sober with a shotgun in his mouth. And it dawned on him that things maybe were not going quite as well as he had thought. And he got into therapy. And it must have been really quite a good therapist. And he was telling a story. And he is able to tell stories about the repetitive nature of all his relationships. It was all the same person with different names, with the same thing. This is where our first date was. This is our second, third date. I wouldn't know what to do. So I, give her a credit card, and that would be the nature of the relationship until she'd get mad at me and kick me out. So he's telling this story about he was driving his wife's car, and he was in a parking lot in a shopping center, and he backed into a pole and dented her car. And he went home and lied to her. He's 20-some years sober at this time, and he's trying to work on this stuff. And he lied to her. And then he went and talked to his AA sponsor. And his AA sponsor was, you're often not helpful, says, Bob, we don't lie to people anymore. And Bob went right into a shame place. He didn't know what was going on, and he went to his therapist. And in talking with his therapist, he started to have a memory of when he was a small child. Bob had congenital defects in his feet, and his mom had gotten him a pair of orthotic shoes. He was about 3. He had a very violently abusive father, violently abusive to him and his mom. And Bob put on these orthotics, and they hurt. And he started to cry. And his mother was terrified of his father, and was terrified after spending all this money on these shoes that Bob was crying and wasn't going, that they would both be beaten. And so she hit him. And he came to realize in that therapy session the exact nature of our wrongs. He was terrified of women's anger. And he had never been able to have a long-term relationship or a healthy relationship, because as soon as there was any tension at all, he bailed without particularly noticing. So in this 5th step, implicit in it is this concept of the exact nature of the wrongs. The exact nature of Bob's wrongs wasn't that he lied. The exact nature of his wrongs was he was afraid of women's anger, and he needed to deal with that for him to eventually be able to have the type of relationship that he would want. Now, sometimes if you're in a 12-step setting, you've got the right sponsor, that type stuff will come out and it'll heal. That'd be fairly fortunate. So there's room for therapists still to help these people to figure this stuff out. And there's an interesting way for us as therapists to keep directing people to remain involved in this thing they call recovery, so they have an ongoing vehicle to help them maintain what they need to maintain, that they don't have to pay for, and that they can do forever, and not always be having to be regarded as pathological and being in therapy with us. So that's the exact nature of our wrongs thing. Step 6. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. Oh, there we are again with the God stuff. So we've done step 4 and 5, and actually if you were to read the big book, and you were to read the part where it has step 4, 5, and 6, and 7, what you would see is step 6 and step 7 in the big book each only get a paragraph. And basically what they say is after you've done step 5 with your trusted advisor, you go back to your room and you spend an hour reviewing whether you've done a good job on your 4th step, and you fully disclose what's been going on in your life. And if you have done all that, then you do the 7th step prayer. And the 7th step prayer is a very Christian prayer that many people love dearly. It's not really to my taste. But basically, when that book was written, you do 5, do 6 and 7 an hour, and boom, they're done forever. Well, 10 years later, Bill Wilson wrote another book called The 12 Steps and the 12 Traditions. And in that book, step 6 and step 7 each got a whole chapter. And the way I think about what happened in those intervening 10 years is there was a maturation on Bill's part about how this stuff actually worked, permitting him to actually articulate sort of the cause and effect of what was going on, and it really changed how he thought and talked about these things and what was recommended. And I think that it really speaks to a very helpful maturation in the overall 12-step thing that we as therapists can help use to keep, as our clients over time, become less and less pathological, and the only reason we're still giving them a diagnosis is so the insurance company will keep paying the bill. Because really what we're doing by that time is coaching them on how to have an enjoyable and pleasant life, or evolving into becoming self-actualized or enlightened or whatever we're doing. Because what we're helping people do is really evolve into the people we want to be, rather than avoiding or treating pathologies. So 6 and 7, this is out of the 12 and 12. It's we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. It's AA's way of stating the best possible attitude one can take in order to make a beginning of this lifetime job. This does not mean that we expect all our character defects to be lifted out of us as the drive to drink was. A few of them may be, but with most of them we shall have to be content with patient improvement. The key words "entirely ready" underline the fact that we want to aim at the very best we know or can learn. So once again, going back to our marathon runner, they've gotten to the point where they're pretty much achieving what they were hoping to achieve, but there's still room for improvement. And I think, for me, I would like to keep learning throughout my life. I would like to keep evolving so that my instances of becoming angry or self-righteous or afraid continue to diminish. There's a bigger period of time between them. When they happen, they're not quite as dramatic, and I get over them more quickly. So that's how I think of what we're working on with our clients. Is we want the crisis to happen less often. We want it to be less intense, or we want to go in the hole less deeply. We want to get out more quickly, and we want to recover from it faster. Rather than, I want to be like blissed out forever. I don't know anyone that's like that. It may be that I just haven't been exposed to enough people, but I don't see it. So this is what we're working for, and so the 6th step is speaks to that. And if you're at all interested, I'd recommend that you read the big book in the 12 and 12 if you're working with people with addictions. I've read a lot of the other 12-step groups texts, and they're good and helpful. A lot of them refer back to the AA Big Book and the AA 12 and 12. Mostly, I think, because they're fairly competent at what they were trying to do. And most of the other texts have a lot of personal stories that if your issue was love and love addict or food or whatever, you'd have your particular details that you would relate to, but the underlying principles would be the same. So read that, because it goes into a lot of other ideas about sort of, now I've gotten to the point where I no longer am overtly mean to my partner, but I still have a tendency to, go like that when the dishes are left in the wrong side of the sink. And I'll speak to that concept in a minute. Humbly ask him to remove our shortcomings. So here's that guy again. Here's a guy or gal. Here's God again, taking care of everything. All I need to do is say the prayer, and boom, I'm good. This this actually is not AA literature. This quote is something that I really like. It was on the desk of Dr. Bob Smith, one of the co-founders, in his office. And you can all read it. I think you probably have it in your handout. And you can also Google it. But the step here is saying we're humbly asking God to remove our shortcomings. And if you read that step in the 12 and 12, it speaks to what the term I would use rather than humility is right-sizedness. Now, one of the things we said earlier is the alcoholic is an egomaniac with an inferiority complex. And so what can happen over time is you do this stuff. You do the 4th and 5th step, and you do the later steps, which you'll probably be doing before 4 and 5. But what happens over time is your low self-esteem starts to come up. And your compensatory arrogance and ego and defenses come down. And you end up right-sized. Now, one of the things that about booze and other drugs is they work. That can be a problem. You know, they make the difficult day go away. They give us the courage to go, address the jerk that did this thing. Somehow we have to learn to live, or to help our clients learn to live without those aids to help us get to where we want to go. And the only reason you have to do that is they stop working, at least for people that end up in 12-step programs. So humility, perpetual quietness of heart. Wouldn't that be a lovely thing to have? I don't know about perpetual, but I would go for a lot of the time. Okay? People that show up in NA or AA, they're not feeling that on the first day. You know, that is the worst day of their lives, although in retrospect it might end up being the best day. But they're not having perpetual quietness of heart. They're worried about paying the lawyer, paying the doctor, having the boyfriend or girlfriend come back. You're not getting found out about this other thing. There's no quietness. It is to have no trouble, is never to be fretted or vexed, irritable or sore, to wonder at nothing that is done to me, to feel nothing done against me. Pretty cool. It is to be at rest when no one praises me, and when I am blamed or despised, is have a blessed home in myself where I can go in and shut the door and pray to my Father in secret and be at peace, as in a deep sea of calmness when all around and about is seeming trouble. That'd be nice, huh? Well, the thing is what you'll see if you get to know people who have gotten to this thing they call emotional sobriety. I'm not talking somebody that just hadn't had a drink or a drug in 20 years, but people that have gotten this thing that they call emotional sobriety, they live a lot like that. Not 100% of the time, and most people have their particular Achilles heel that they're a real jerk about. But they've largely gotten to a point where their well-being is no longer contingent either on what other people think of them, or more importantly, what they think other people think of them. And what we come to see for most of us, just as people, and therapists included, is a lot of our thought process and our feelings and our defenses have to do either with what other people think of us, or more importantly, what we think they think of us. And it fits back into, when I get this or I get out of that, then I'll be okay. When I get this accolade, our neighbors, we don't air our dirty laundry in public. What do they say? One of the rules in the alcoholic home is don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. It comes from the adult children of alcoholic thing. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. We present this person to the outside world, and then we have our inside self where our life goes on. And that's where we get to, if you really knew me, you wouldn't like me. And I add to that one, and if you do like me, there's something wrong with you. That's what we're working on changing, this thing that we call recovery. Or ideally, simply for us as therapists, is we're helping people overcome their anxiety and their depression and their relationship issues, is have people more fully and completely come to know who they are and want to be that person. We're not trying to change people to be someone else. We're trying to help people become more themselves. And to do that, we have to make it safe for them to be themselves. So we have to uncover all these sources of guilt and shame and anxiety and fear and anger and resentment, and hold on to the ones that are beneficial and unload the ones that aren't, to allow people to be more competent in their relationship with themselves and others. So I think that, although, again, the language of it isn't exactly my language, I think the underlying concepts are profoundly important and worthy to aspire for. And when I think of emotional sobriety, I think of people that sort of hang out in this space a lot of the time, where they're okay. I'm okay. I've got that faith thing, that third step, footwork and faith. They're in that space a lot of the time. Once again, not all the time. That would probably be a good place to stop. Does anybody have any questions before we break for lunch? Okay, well, we'll start again at 1. Thank you very much for listening and paying attention.